There's a moment most people never prepare for, not because it's rare, but because it feels almost impossible to choose. It's the moment you finally stop talking to them. No more checking your phone every few minutes. No more rereading old messages trying to decode hidden meaning. No more sending just one last text, hoping it lands differently this time. You go quiet, and not the kind of silence that's filled with waiting, but the kind that feels final, heavy, and uncertain. And even though you made that choice for your own peace, there's a part of you that wonders what's happening on the other side of that silence. Are they relieved? Do they even notice? Or are they slowly starting to feel the absence of something they never fully understood while they had it? Because when it comes to an avoidant, things don't unfold the way you expect. Their reactions aren't immediate. Their emotions don't show up on time. And what looks like indifference on the surface often hides a completely different internal experience. The stages they go through after you stop talking to them are quiet, delayed, and deeply conflicted. And if you don't understand these stages, you might misinterpret their silence as a lack of care, when in reality, it's something far more complex. This isn't about giving you false hope or telling you that every avoidant comes back. That's not how this works. This is about understanding the psychological shift that begins the moment you step back. Because your silence doesn't just remove you from their life, it removes the emotional safety net they didn't even realize they were relying on. And when that safety disappears, something starts to change inside them. Slowly, quietly, but powerfully. At first, something unexpected happens. Instead of panic, there's relief. And if you knew that in the moment, it would probably hurt more than anything. Because while you're sitting there feeling the weight of missing them, they seem to be doing just fine. There's no message, no attempt to reconnect, no visible reaction at all. And that silence can feel like confirmation of your deepest fear, that maybe they never cared the way you did. But this relief isn't what it looks like. It's not happiness. It's not freedom in the way most people think of it. It's the release of pressure. When you were present, even if you weren't asking for much, your emotional availability created a kind of quiet expectation, not demands, but presence. And for someone who struggles with closeness, even that can feel overwhelming over time. So when you disappear, the pressure lifts. They can breathe again. They can go back to their familiar space where no one is expecting emotional consistency from them. But here's the part most people don't realize. This relief is temporary. It's surface level. It's a reaction, not a resolution. Because what they've actually lost hasn't fully registered yet. The connection, the attention, the stability you brought into their life, all of that takes time to be felt in your absence. Avoidants don't process loss immediately. They suppress, they delay, they distract. So in this early stage, it's not that they don't care, it's that they haven't caught up to the reality of what your absence truly means. And while you might be tempted to break the silence during this phase, thinking you've been forgotten, this is actually the moment where your silence is doing the most work, even if it doesn't look like it yet. Then comes the phase where their confidence quietly steps in to protect them. They tell themselves a story, one that keeps them in control. They assume this is temporary, that you'll come back like before, that this is just another emotional wave that will pass. And in their mind, nothing has really changed. Because if they believe you're still emotionally available, even from a distance, they don't have to confront anything real. This is where their ego fills the gap left by your silence. Not in an arrogant way, but in a self-protective one. It reassures them that they haven't lost you, that they still have access to you whenever they decide to reach out. And this belief keeps them comfortable. It allows them to stay exactly where they've always been, without growth, without reflection, without facing the emotional weight of the connection. But this stage depends on one thing: your consistency in staying silent. Because the moment you break it, even slightly, it reinforces their belief. It tells them that no matter how distant they become, you'll always find your way back. And that removes any reason for them to shift internally. So while it might feel like nothing is happening during this time, something very important is actually being tested. The pattern, the cycle, the unspoken dynamic between you and them. And for the first time, if you hold your ground, that dynamic starts to crack. As more time passes, something subtle begins to change. It's not dramatic, it doesn't happen overnight, but there's a shift, a quiet disruption in their normal emotional rhythm. They start to notice your absence in moments they didn't expect. A thought crosses their mind when something reminds them of you. A habit feels incomplete without your presence. And suddenly, the silence isn't just silence anymore, it feels like something is missing. This is where curiosity begins. Not strong enough yet to make them reach out, but enough to make them think. They start to question the situation. Why haven't you come back? Why are you still silent? Is this different from before? And these questions create a kind of tension they're not used to sitting with. Because for someone who is used to emotional distance, they rarely have to face uncertainty like this. Usually they are the ones pulling away, knowing the other person will eventually close the gap. But now, the roles have shifted, and that unfamiliar position starts to affect them in ways they don't fully understand. They might not talk about it, they might not even consciously acknowledge it, but internally, something is moving. The certainty they once felt starts to weaken, and in its place, doubt begins to grow. And then comes one of the most revealing stages, the stage where they start looking for you without actually reaching for you. They won't text, they won't call, but they'll check, quietly, indirectly, almost like they're trying to reconnect without risking rejection. They might view your stories almost immediately after you post them. They might scroll through your profile, noticing small changes. They might revisit old conversations, reading messages they once ignored more carefully now. It's not direct communication, but it's not indifference either. This behavior says something important. It shows that your absence has finally reached them, but they're still not ready to be vulnerable. They want to feel close again, but only in a way that keeps them safe. No exposure, no emotional risk, just observation. And if you don't understand this stage, it can confuse you deeply, because from your side, it feels like mixed signals. Why are they watching but not speaking? Why do they seem present but distant at the same time? But this is how avoidants begin to process connection after distance. Slowly, indirectly, carefully. They move toward you in the only way they know how, without fully stepping out of their comfort zone. And right here, this is where everything starts to build, because what they're feeling now is only the beginning of something much deeper that's about to surface. And just when it seems like everything is staying in that quiet, distant space, something deeper begins to surface. Not in a way that's obvious, not in a way they would openly admit, but internally the emotional delay finally starts to catch up with them. Because what you felt weeks ago, maybe even months ago, they are only now beginning to experience. That heaviness, that confusion, that sense of something slipping away, it doesn't hit them when you leave. It hits them later when the distractions fade and the silence becomes real. Avoidants don't process emotions in real time. They suppress, they compartmentalize, they move forward without looking too closely at what they're leaving behind. But emotions don't disappear just because they're ignored. They wait. And when they come back, they don't ask for permission. They just arrive. So now, in moments when they're alone, when there's nothing to distract them, something unfamiliar starts to settle in. A kind of emotional weight they can't easily push away. They might not label it as missing you, they might not even fully understand it, but they feel it, and it lingers longer than they're comfortable with. This is the stage where the connection begins to feel real again. Not because you're present, but because your absence has finally created space for those emotions to exist. And even though they might still stay silent, something inside them is no longer at ease. As that emotional awareness grows, it slowly transforms into something more specific, a sense of missing your presence, not just you as a person, but the way you existed in their life, the way you showed up consistently, the way you made things feel stable, even when they didn't fully appreciate it at the time. They start to notice the small things, the conversations that used to fill empty moments, the comfort of knowing someone understood them without forcing them to explain everything, the quiet reassurance of having someone there, even if they didn't always respond in the way you needed. And this realization doesn't come all at once. It builds piece by piece, memory by memory, until it becomes harder to ignore. Because now it's not just curiosity anymore, it's absence with meaning. They may try to distract themselves, fill their time, shift their focus, but certain things will remind them of you in ways they can't control. A phrase, a habit, a moment that feels incomplete without your presence attached to it. And in those moments, something softens inside them. This is where they begin to understand, even if only subconsciously, that what they had wasn't as replaceable as they once believed. And that realization is where the dynamic starts to shift in a way it never has before. But with that realization comes something they struggle with deeply: inner conflict. Because now they're caught between two opposing forces inside themselves. One part of them feels the pull toward you, the desire to reconnect, to close the distance, to bring back something that felt meaningful. But the other part, the part that fears vulnerability, closeness, and emotional exposure, tells them to stay exactly where they are. And this internal battle isn't simple. It's not a clear decision. It's a back and forth that can last days, sometimes even longer. One moment they think about reaching out, the next they convince themselves it's better not to. One moment they feel the absence strongly, the next they try to shut it down and return to their comfort zone. This is why their behavior can feel so inconsistent, because it's not about you changing, it's about them struggling with themselves. They're not used to sitting with emotions like this. They're not used to wanting connection while also fearing it at the same time. And in this stage, they often do nothing. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know which part of themselves to listen to. So they stay in that in between space, watching, thinking, feeling, but not acting. And from your perspective, it might look like nothing is happening, but internally, everything is shifting. Eventually, that internal tension becomes too strong to stay completely still, and this is when they start testing the waters. Not in a direct way, not with clear communication, but through small, almost invisible actions that let them feel closer without fully exposing themselves. They might react to something you post. Not a full message, just a small signal. They might start viewing your stories more consistently, almost immediately after you post them. They might find subtle ways to appear present without actually engaging in a conversation. These actions aren't random. They're intentional, even if they don't fully admit it. It's their way of checking if you're still there, if the door is still open, if they can approach without being rejected. Because at this point, something has shifted. Before, they assumed you would always be available. Now they're not so sure. And that uncertainty makes them cautious. It makes them observe before they act. And if you respond too quickly or too eagerly during this stage, it can reset everything. It can remove that sense of uncertainty they're starting to feel. But if you stay grounded, if you don't chase or overextend, it keeps the dynamic balanced in a way they're not used to. And that balance is what slowly pulls them closer. Then finally comes the moment that feels small on the surface, but carries so much weight underneath it. The first reach out, it doesn't come as a confession. It doesn't come with emotional depth. It usually arrives in the simplest form possible, something casual, almost detached. A message that doesn't acknowledge the distance, the silence, or everything that led up to it. Something like, "Hey, how have you been?" Or "I just thought of you." Simple words, easy to overlook. But what most people don't see is how much internal resistance had to be overcome just to send that. Because for them, this isn't just a message. It's a step toward vulnerability, a risk, even if it's a small one. It's them breaking through their own patterns, even if only slightly. But here's where things become crucial. How you respond in this moment matters more than you think. Because they're not just reaching out to talk, they're observing. They're trying to understand if the dynamic is still the same or if something has changed. If you respond exactly the way you always did, immediately, emotionally, fully available, it can signal to them that nothing has shifted, that they can step back into the connection without changing anything about themselves. But if your energy feels different, calmer, more grounded, less reactive, it creates a new experience for them, one they don't fully understand yet, but one that makes them pause and reconsider how they approach you moving forward. And this moment, this simple, casual reach out, is where everything that's been building internally finally begins to show itself on the outside. And even after they reach out, even after breaking through that internal resistance and finally stepping back into your space, something about their energy still feels distant, almost like they're there, but not fully there. The conversation might feel normal on the surface, maybe even light or casual, but underneath it, there's a noticeable lack of emotional depth. It's as if everything that happened before, the silence, the distance, the shift, is being quietly ignored. This is the stage where they act unbothered. Not because they didn't feel anything, not because your absence didn't affect them, but because showing that would mean exposing a level of vulnerability they're not ready to face. So instead, they lean into familiarity. They talk to you like nothing ever changed, like no time passed, like the connection is still exactly where it left off. And for you, this can feel confusing, even frustrating, because part of you wants acknowledgement. You want to know that the silence mattered, that it impacted them in some way, but they don't offer that. Not directly, not yet. Instead, they stay in this controlled version of connection where they can engage without fully opening up, where they can keep things light, safe, and predictable. It's their way of easing back in without confronting the emotional weight of everything that led to this moment. And if you're not aware of this stage, it's easy to misread it, to think they've come back unchanged, that nothing has shifted. But the truth is, something has shifted. They just don't know how to show it yet. As the interaction continues, something subtle but important begins to happen. They start paying closer attention to you, not just to what you say, but to how you say it, your tone, your energy, your availability. They're observing in a way they didn't before, because now there's uncertainty. Before, they felt secure in knowing you would always be there, that no matter how much distance they created, you would eventually close it. But now, they're not so sure. And that uncertainty makes them more aware of you than they've ever been. They begin looking for signs. Are you still emotionally invested? Are you responding the same way you used to? Or is there a difference, something more grounded, more self-contained? And here's what's important. They don't just notice your words, they feel your shift. If your energy has changed, if you're no longer chasing, no longer over-explaining, no longer trying to pull closeness out of them, it creates something unfamiliar for them, a space where they can't rely on the old dynamic anymore. And that space is where their perception of you starts to evolve. Because for the first time, you're not just someone who's always there. You're someone who chose to step back, someone who created distance and held it. And that changes how they see your value, even if they don't say it out loud. But just as things start to feel like they're moving forward, just as the connection begins to rebuild in small, subtle ways, something happens that can feel like a step backward. They pull away again, not completely, not in the same way as before, but enough for you to feel it. The replies become slower. The energy becomes less consistent. The presence they were starting to show fades slightly. And just like that, you're left wondering if everything is repeating itself. But this stage isn't the same as the first time they pulled away. This time, it's not about disinterest. It's about overwhelm, because now they're not operating from detachment, they're operating from awareness. They feel more, they recognize more. And that emotional intensity, even if it's still controlled, is unfamiliar to them. So when it starts to build too quickly, when the connection begins to feel real again, their instinct is to create space, not to lose you, but to regulate themselves. And this is where most people make a critical mistake. They see this pullback and immediately react. They reach out more, they try to fix it, they try to restore the connection to what it was just moments ago. But doing that removes the space they're trying to create, and it pushes them further back into avoidance. What they need in this moment isn't pressure, it's stability. The kind that doesn't chase them when they step back. The kind that stays grounded even when things feel uncertain. And if that space is respected, if you don't rush in to close the gap, something begins to change again. But this time it's deeper. more permanent. They start to realize your value in a way they never did before, not just intellectually, but emotionally. Because now they've experienced your absence. They've felt what it's like when you're no longer consistently present. And they've also felt the difference in how you show up now, calmer, more centered, less dependent on their responses. And that contrast is powerful. It forces them to reflect, even if quietly, to recognize that what you offered wasn't something easily replaceable, that your presence wasn't just convenient, it was meaningful. And this realization doesn't come with grand gestures or sudden confessions. It comes in small shifts, in the way they engage, in the effort they begin to show, in the subtle increase in consistency, because now there's something they didn't feel before. The awareness that they could actually lose you. Not in a dramatic way, not in a loud emotional sense, but in a quiet, real way where you simply move on and don't look back. And that possibility changes how they approach you. From that awareness, something even deeper begins to take shape. A fear that feels unfamiliar to them. Not the kind of fear that pushes them away, but the kind that makes them pause and reconsider, the fear of losing you for real. Because before, distance felt safe, it felt controlled, it felt like something they could manage without consequences. But now, they've seen what happens when that distance becomes too real. When silence isn't just temporary, but sustained. And it leaves an impact they can't ignore. They begin to think differently, not just about you, but about themselves, about their patterns, about the way they've handled connection in the past. And while they may not fully understand it yet, there's a growing sense that something needs to shift, that what they had with you requires a different version of them if it's going to exist in a healthy way. And this is where everything reaches a quiet turning point. Because from here, they can't go back to complete unawareness. They can't pretend it didn't matter. They can't fully return to the same level of detachment without feeling the weight of what they might lose. But at the same time, stepping forward fully still requires something they struggle with: vulnerability. And that's what makes this stage so important. Because it's not about whether they come back, they already have. It's about how they come back. Whether they stay in the same patterns or begin to shift into something more consistent, more present, more real. And that decision is what determines everything that happens next. And from that turning point, something new begins to form. Not quickly, not perfectly, and definitely not in a straight line, but slowly you start to notice a shift in how they show up. It's subtle at first, almost easy to miss if you're still focused on how things used to be, but if you pay attention, there's a difference. Their effort becomes a little more consistent, not overwhelming, not intense, not the kind of energy you may have once hoped for, but steadier, more intentional. They check in a little more often. They stay in conversations a little longer. They don't disappear as abruptly as before. And while it might not look like much on the outside, for them, this is a significant step. Because consistency is something avoidants struggle with when it comes to emotional connection. It requires presence. It requires awareness. It requires staying instead of escaping when things start to feel real. And for the first time, they're trying to do that. But it's important to understand something here. This effort doesn't come from comfort, it comes from tension, from that internal awareness that they could lose you if they fall back into old patterns. So they're navigating something unfamiliar, trying to stay connected while still managing their instinct to create distance. And that's why this stage feels fragile, because it's progress, but it's not stability yet. And if you expect perfection here, if you expect them to suddenly become everything they weren't before, you'll miss what's actually happening. Growth for them looks like small, consistent shifts, not dramatic transformation. As that consistency slowly builds, something else begins to soften: their emotional walls. Not completely, not all at once, but enough for you to feel it. There's a change in their tone, in the way they respond, in the way they engage with you. They might start asking slightly deeper questions. They might show moments of genuine curiosity about your life, your feelings, your experiences, not in an overwhelming way, but in a way that feels more present than before. And sometimes, in quiet, almost unplanned moments, you might catch a glimpse of something even deeper, a hint of vulnerability, a sentence that carries more emotion than they intended to show, a pause in their words that reveals they're thinking more carefully about what they're sharing. These moments are small, but they matter. Because for someone who is used to protecting themselves emotionally, even the slightest shift toward openness is significant. It means they're starting to feel safer, not just with you, but within themselves. But here's where it becomes delicate. Because the moment you notice that softness, there can be a temptation to lean in harder, to ask more, to go deeper, to finally get the connection you've been waiting for. And while that desire is completely understandable, moving too fast here can cause them to retreat again because they're still learning how to exist in this space. They're still adjusting to feeling more than they're used to. And if it becomes too intense too quickly, their instinct will still be to pull back. So this stage isn't about pushing for more. It's about allowing what's already happening to unfold naturally. But even as they soften, even as they begin to open in small ways, there's still a part of them that resists, a part that hasn't fully let go of their old patterns. And this creates one of the most emotionally complex stages in this entire process, the vulnerability struggle. Because now they're no longer disconnected. They feel the connection, they recognize it, they even want it. But at the same time, they're afraid of it. Afraid of what it means to rely on someone, afraid of what could happen if they fully let themselves care, afraid of losing control over their emotions in a way they're not used to. And this fear doesn't always show up clearly. Sometimes it looks like hesitation, like pulling back slightly after getting closer, like changing the subject when things get too real, like creating small amounts of distance even in the middle of connection. And from your perspective, it can feel confusing, even painful, because you can feel that they care, you can sense that something is different, but at the same time, there's still that inconsistency, that hesitation, that invisible barrier that hasn't fully come down. And this is where patience becomes everything. Not passive waiting, but grounded understanding, because they're standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. And whether they step forward or step back depends on how safe that space feels to them. And eventually, everything leads to this moment, the moment where a decision has to be made, not always out loud, not always in a clear, direct way, but internally, something settles. This is the choice point. They can no longer stay in the middle. They can't keep one foot in connection and one foot in distance without feeling the tension of it. Because now they're aware. They've felt your absence. They've experienced your shift. They've started to reconnect and they know what's at stake. So the question becomes, what are they going to do with that awareness? Do they step forward and meet you in a more consistent, emotionally present way? Or do they retreat back into the patterns that feel safer, even if they know it means losing you? And this choice isn't just about you, it's about them, about whether they're ready to face the parts of themselves they've avoided for so long, about whether they're willing to move through discomfort instead of escaping it, about whether they can allow connection to exist without feeling overwhelmed by it. And this is the part no one can control but them. You can influence the environment, you can hold your boundaries, you can stay grounded in your own growth. But the decision is theirs, and that decision leads to the final outcome, the part everyone wants clarity on, but few are prepared to truly understand. Because when they come back, it doesn't always mean they've changed. Sometimes they come back with more awareness, more effort, more intention. They move slower but steadier. They try in their own way to build something different from what existed before. And while it may not be perfect, it feels more real, more balanced, more mutual. And in those cases, the connection has the potential to evolve into something healthier, not because everything is suddenly easy, but because both people are showing up differently. But other times they come back the same patterns, same distance, same inconsistency. The only difference is the temporary realization they had during your absence, but without the deeper work to sustain change. And in those situations, the cycle repeats, the closeness, the distance, the confusion, the silence. And this is where your awareness becomes the most important part of the entire story. Because by the time you reach this stage, you're not the same person who first went silent. You've seen the pattern, you've felt the impact of stepping back, you've experienced what happens when you stop chasing and start choosing yourself. So now the focus shifts. It's no longer just about whether they come back, it's about what you accept when they do. Because their return is only part of the story. Your standards, your boundaries, your willingness to walk away if nothing has truly changed. That's what defines how this ends. And maybe the most important realization of all is this: the silence you once feared wasn't the end of your power, it was the beginning of it.